Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Coming up shortly is filmmaker Ferne Pearlstein. But first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Ferne Pearlstein is a director, cinematographer, and editor based in New York City. Her most recent film is Canceled, the story of cancel culture, a nuanced look at this controversial topic, produced by Trevor and Time Studios for MSNBC's Turning Point series. As a director and producer, with husband and producing partner Robert Edwards, she has had 4 features premiere at Tribeca, including SUMO EAST and WEST, and the narratives Land of the Blind, starring Ray Fiennes and Donald Sutherland, and One More Time, starring Christopher Walken. The most recent of those 4 features was the critically acclaimed The Last Laugh in 2016, about taboos in humor. Ferne, welcome into the back room.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me about your childhood and whether or not you had any sort of creative experience through family, were there other artists in the family, other film people, filmmakers?
No. I was obsessed with films, but it was at a time where I would say, no one ever considered that someone like me in the suburbs of Philadelphia would ever become a filmmaker. Like, it never occurred to me. So I was, I spent, 1 year wanting to, paint, 1 year wanting to, all different kinds of artist things. And then as, life started getting closer to college, it was more like I was going to be a lawyer with encouragement, to be a lawyer. And
was that at the urging of your parents? All of our Jewish parents always want us to be lawyers or doctors.
Yeah.
They never want us to be filmmakers. Don't go to law school. Be a filmmaker.
Yeah, exactly.
Never hear that.
I do remember a conversation with my mother when I was, probably in middle school, where I was like, I'm going to be a painter. And she said, no, I think you should be a lawyer or a doctor. And I thought, well, I know I don't want to be a doctor. Mm-hmm. So it went from there. But then as a sort of sign from God, if you believe in that, I got my LSATs back. And I was like, oh, I'm not gonna be a lawyer.
Scratch that off the list.
And I woke up the next day and I said, I'm gonna be a photographer. I don't know where it came from. It was my last semester of college. I took my first photo course, and then I got into documentary photography, and then it sort of morphed into documentary film.
Mm-hmm. And in that period, you said you watched a lot of films. What were the films that resonated with you most, and who were your early inspirations, perhaps, as filmmakers?
Well, I would say when I was young, I was just obsessed with going to movies, but I wouldn't say I had a necessarily sophisticated view. Mm-hmm. Then when I moved to New York, funny enough, like Hal Hartley was one of my favorite filmmakers, and, just that sort of New York independent scene. But I was always into documentary. Mm-hmm. And even when I was a documentary photographer, it didn't occur to me to go into film. Like, it just never even crossed my mind. But when I was a still photographer in the time where all of it was pre-internet, and when all the magazines were folding, and basically I was getting jobs doing old-fashioned paste up. So what my friend calls the best entry-level position in New York City, I worked for the classified section of the Village Voice. So I would go at 6 p.m. on a Monday night, and with rubber cement and box cutters, I would put all the ads out. So I got a great apartment and a great job working for a Japanese newspaper, where I started taking photographs for him. And I have all these photos published in Japan, but never have had anything published in the States.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a side thing. And then the filmmakers that I was drawn to were like Robert Altman, like these films that felt documentary-like.
Mm-hmm. And Looking back on that period and where the industry is today, have you seen an evolution where it's harder to make documentaries, easier to make documentaries? And I ask that because it seems like there's such a shift in the documentary space, especially with the streamers, towards crime, true crime, celebrity biopics. Like that's what's so commercially viable today that so many other types of documentaries can't seem to get the same attention that perhaps
Yeah.
they did years ago.
Well, and the films that I have made are not super fundable, easy to fund films. This last film about cancel culture was
Hmm.
a work for hire based on my film The Last Laugh. But as you can imagine, a film about Holocaust humor was not easy to fund. I was trying to make it
Right.
since 1903, but definitely a shift. I mean, when I started. So when I went to film school at Stanford. In fact, we know someone in common. Cynthia Wade was a
Oh,
classmate
cool.
of,
Sure.
and I was a still photographer, so it was natural that I became a cinematographer, and
Hmm.
people would have me shoot their films, and then I built a nice career shooting documentaries from there, and there was a reason I brought that up. Oh, but at the time, I there were no other women cinematographers, and I was shooting in film, so it was very niche at the time. So documentaries in film, woman. So in a way, my career in the beginning, my shooting career took off because I fit the quota of all
Right.
these films,
Hmm.
right? So in those days, it was great. And then I remember I stayed working in film. I mean, even The Last Laugh is shot in film. And then I remember the DV craze
Hmm.
started, and when anybody could pick up a camera and did. And there was a change there because it went from people hiring you to shoot their documentary to, oh, they only would offer it to me if they had a hard, like, oh, we have to shoot this conference. Can you do that?
Hmm.
Because either shoot their own, the producer would shoot it,
Right.
whatever. I remember the first time I realized there was a shift there was I was up for this job. I had been shooting for like 10 or 15 years, pretty big films. I had won the Sundance Cinematography Prize for one of them. And I didn't get the job over someone who had been shooting for a year because I didn't have enough DV experience,
Hmm.
like as if I couldn't figure out how to do that. So that was the first shift. And then, frankly, my husband is a screenwriter and sort of he also came out of that Stanford documentary program, but he sort of veered into narrative films, and I sort of went with him for a little while. Like
Hmm.
I, helped produce them. I helped, like I would be second unit director, second unit cinematographer. So I sort of uh, was there for a few years, and then when I came back, suddenly the market was saturated. Like there were a lot of women cinematographers. There were a lot of people, like so many people were able to make films. And then there was the shift to suddenly they were so high, like, oh, to be a documentary photographer became so much more important than it ever had been.
Hmm.
And it was, but again, films that I was interested in making were very hard to fund. So I couldn't compete sometimes for the grants and for that in that world. And now of course it's shifting again as all of the well, we don't know what's going to happen.
You made Last Laugh 7 years ago, 8 years ago?
It came out at Tribeca in 2016.
Right. So that doesn't seem like a long time ago. However, and we're going to morph in and out of conversations
Right.
about The Last Laugh and cancel culture. The two have overlapping themes, obviously. Can you make that film today?
Well, it's so funny you say that because how it started was, in 1990, a friend of mine and I met this survivor, and we had just, it was right after Mouse had come out, just won the Pulitzer Prize. We were
Hmm.
obsessed with it. We talked to the survivor about it, in a very respectful way. And at that time, because Mouse was the first graphic novel, I don't
Hmm.
think people realized that. And her reference point were the Sunday Funny pages. She's like, you can't. you can't, make fun of the Holocaust in the Sunday funny pages. What, how, and then, but she hadn't read it, and it struck this conversation. So my friend went back and wrote this 20-page paper for a class he had been taking on anti-Semitism, actually. And he did all this research, and there were all these examples of humor in the camps, in the displaced person camps, in the ghettos. And he wrote this paper, The Last Laugh. I see him 2 years later when I was making my thesis film for Stanford, and he hands it to me and he says, make this into a film. So that was 1993. And of course, I knew for a film like that, first of all, I was going to open it up to post-war humor, Mel Brooks, obviously. But I also knew I needed a little more experience before I dove into a film like that because of who I wanted in the film. And I hadn't even graduated from Stanford yet. Anyway, so that was 93. And 98, I meet my husband, how we met was he hired me to shoot his film. And then he never made it because he spent all his money going back and forth from California to New York to visit me. So we never finished that film.
I'm assuming that wasn't in the budget.
No, it wasn't. So then we started to work on the film together. And then Life is Beautiful came out. And it was like, okay, if we make the film now, the whole film is going to be about Life is Beautiful. And we didn't want that. So we sort of backed off. But at the time, I used to say, when I make this film, I'm going to get hate mail. I'm going to get death threats. People aren't ready for this film. And then in 2006, The Aristocrats came out.
Mm-hmm.
I went to see it at the ArcLight in LA. And you see the joke that Gilbert Gottfried makes about 9/11, which launched launched into The Aristocrats, which inspired the filmmakers to make the film. And the audience, huge theater, and the audience was rolling. And I'm like, people are ready.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when and still it took me till 2011. I felt like there was more satire about difficult things by then than there had been when I first started.
Sure.
So it was, okay, maybe I could do this, maybe. Okay, well now in the last, couple of years, I don't think I could make the film now. I just don't think. I mean, as it stands, only one person gave me money for that film.
Well, I was going to ask you where the funding came from.
It came from one, anonymous donor who was like, here, would this get you started? And then I would shoot and edit, and I'd get to a certain point and run out of the money. And then she gave me a little more. And then she gave me a little more till I finally, and because I'm the cinematographer, director, producer, editor, my husband, the writer and producer, and I own the camera gear. I edited on my laptop. I could get away, even though I shot it in film, I could get away with, not getting paid, which sucks, but I could make the film.
Can I ask what the budget was?
I would say the budget, if I had gotten paid for all of those jobs and he had gotten paid, and we didn't fair use all the clips, it would have been between 1.1 and 1.3.
And you were able to do it for what?
$650.
That's great.
I mean, the clips alone was probably be at least 250,000.
Oh, sure. I was going to ask you about It's Now or Never, Elvis. Because I made
guess what? I was able to fair use that.
That's very impressive.
But I was able to fair use it for the scene it's in. But I wanted to use it over the credits, so I had to pay. But they were incredible. We showed them the scene, and that the estate was so moved by the scene that he gave it to us for $2,500.
Wow.
And then we were able to, what do they call it?
Yeah, Most Favored Nations.
Most Favored Nation. So that was pretty incredible.
Yeah. No, I had a similar situation with Yoko Ono and her and John Lennon's song, Oh My Love, which was our wedding song, Adrian and I, and I wanted to use it for the wedding scene. And she was incredibly generous and gracious, did the same thing. And I remember watching your film thinking, got to ask her how she got that Elvis song, because that ain't cheap.
I know. I got really lucky.
Yeah. And so what's your process for choosing a subject?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to work backwards because I will say that after I finish a project, it's like that feeling after a breakup when you can't bear to, share your soul with another human. That's what I feel like with my features, I would say, the
Mm-hmm.
feature film. Like how can I give myself to
Right.
another, in the same way? But so I am someone that has to really be obsessed with it
Mm-hmm.
because it's a marriage.
So did
I
you
mean, my
feel like the Holocaust should be something like was there a deep feeling in
it's
you
more
that it
it's
should be something we can find humor in? Not about the
well,
atrocity itself, but as you
I would
explain in the
like to
film,
say
all
that
the things around it.
I was attracted to that film not because of the Holocaust, but because the idea of using humor
Mm-hmm.
with tragedy. That is my MO in
Mm-hmm.
life.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would be the Judy Gold making the jokes, but I would be the one that gravitated towards her,
Mm-hmm. Writing
to
them
hear,
for her.
yeah, or just needing that
Mm-hmm.
release valve, like needing to hear somebody,
Well, you
make.
mentioned Judy Gold, and she has a joke in your film which I find hilarious, which to me kind of crystallizes the whole point of the film when she says, "Oh, I wonder if I had been in the Holocaust and like waiting online naked to get it into the gas chamber, would I hold in my stomach?" Because not only is that just funny for being funny, but it's also a biting indictment on body image issues that women face.
Absolutely.
So it's like, why can't that be funny? And the point that a lot of people make is that you don't make jokes about the Holocaust, but you can find humor in things around it. And Renee, one of your subjects, a Holocaust survivor, she handles that subject very well in what she finds funny or what she did during the Holocaust that made her and her fellow concentration camp prisoners laugh or feel good. And so, why isn't that okay? Why isn't any of that okay?
Well, you know what? I think that the Judy Gold joke, which is a great example, and to me, the funniest joke in the film,
Yes, I agree with that.
I think that joke, the reason people think that is so funny is it's such a universal joke. It's, as you say, it's about body image. We've all had these thoughts, in our minds. We've been there. So that one is acceptable. What I've learned is evoking the gas chambers, evoking the images of the camps. That's where people feel like it's verboten. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's what they respond to. But again, that joke isn't about murders and it is more just a thought we've all had and we would never say it out loud. And so when she says it out loud, it's hilarious,
Well,
right?
yeah, because she's right. She's not talking about genocide. It's really about a woman concerned about her body. And because I'm so concerned about my body, what if I was in the worst possible situation? Would I still be vain and worried about my body? And that is just fucking hilarious. And that
Yeah.
should be okay.
But you'd be surprised because nobody's ever complained to me about that joke. And that's my theory because they've all sort of been like, oh, I've had thoughts like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where they have a problem, I'll give you two examples, which are in a way similar kinds of jokes. Larry David did a was the host of Saturday Night Live. I don't know if you remember this.
Mm-hmm.
He um, did it in his stand-up talk, in character of his Larry David persona of being a jackass
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. And what, if he was online, would he, like, and saw, would he hit on a woman?
Right.
Well, I have to tell you, I can't tell you how many phone calls and emails and texts, Facebook posts I got asking me, is that okay? Is that
Mm-hmm.
okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, it evokes the imagery and it feels to people like that crosses the line. But why, like you back to this Judy Gold joke. I mean, it's almost a cliche, that idea of like, if you're nervous, imagine people naked when you're giving a speech. You know what I mean? It's
Right. Mm-hmm.
no different. It's just where the placement is. And when you're on a stage, looking at people in an audience naked, that's not a possible scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But they are naked, in the camps, right? So that makes it one level more. Anyway, but then there's the joke that Joan Rivers made on her show where she says, I haven't seen a German look that hot since they were throwing Jews into the ovens.
See,
People were really. Oh, I didn't say
see,
I was.
I say this as a Jew, so if you're about to send me hate mail, just know that I'm a freaking Jew and I can say this. I find that funny. It's funny. It's comedy. Right? And this is where the linkage to the two films I really want to talk to you most about today, where the real linkage is, because it's so subjective. In The Last Laugh at the Survivors Convention, you have one person, I think, who said, I don't know how I would have gotten through this without humor. And then there was that man who was like, there's nothing funny about the Holocaust. Nothing, ever. Nothing. Okay. Is there a right or a wrong? There isn't. And it's like, turn the shit off if you don't like it, right? If you don't like it, don't read it, don't listen to it, don't vote for it. It gets dangerous when a few people in our society become the arbiters of what's right, what's appropriate, what's funny, what's artistic. And there used to be a time in comedy, starting with perhaps Lenny Bruce, maybe even going back further with Mel Brooks and the Catskills in that era, where comedians can push the envelope. And David Steinberg in your film has a great quote. Things that make you uncomfortable aren't necessarily the wrong thing. Sometimes it's exactly the right thing. And isn't comedy supposed to make you wince, make you cringe, but also laugh because it lets the air out in ways you can't through other mediums?
Yes, I fall in a couple of different places on that, right? So I think it's context. Who's your audience? If Larry David made that same joke on Curb where his audience knows what they're getting, nobody would have been upset.
Right.
It's in line with what he does. But then you open it up to a general audience on NBC, and suddenly, it's not necessarily his audience watching. I do believe that all these things come to play, right? It's got to be funny.
Right.
What's the intent? Who's the audience? The context. But I said intent too fast. I think it comes down to intent. I think that there are mean-spirited jokes and they can cross a line. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'll give you an example of something that, because one of the questions I asked all the comedians in The Last Laugh is, do you have a line? What's your line? And I always joke that everybody had a line except for Gilbert Gottfried, who has no line whatsoever. And I had a line. And so there were those jokes that I'm sure you've heard. They're like those playground jokes of, what's the difference between a pizza and a Jew? A pizza doesn't scream when you put it in the oven. Right?
Oh, hello.
Had you never heard that?
I have not.
Oh, wow. Well, there's a whole bunch of those jokes. I mean,
so that's a line. That's a line for you?
Well, okay. So these are a certain kind of jokes. Now, look, they're only meant to be mean-spirited. Like, who was telling those jokes? And I'm sure it's not just, I'm sure in every community there are those kinds of jokes, right?
It's a one-dimensional joke. Doesn't have a lot of.
It's not meant to like ask questions, make you think, any of those things.
Right.
And actually, I wasn't going to use. I didn't want to use those jokes. And in the film, you remember Renee and her daughter are watching YouTube clips of people do Holocaust jokes.
That was fascinating.
And at one point, they found this. Must have been a Reddit page or something. I don't know, it was before I knew what Reddit was. And it was all these jokes like that. And it was cringy. Like they were, and of course I'm shooting, right? So they're both up against their screens, right? So they're kind of blocking the screen and I'm filming behind them, trying to get a good shot, and they're reading one after the other. And it was one was more uncomfortable than the last. And I was like, am I going to use this? I was frustrated with the shot. And then all of a sudden, Renee starts hysterically laughing. And then she reads the joke at the bottom. And the joke was, why did Hitler really commit suicide? He got the gas bill. But when you hear a Auschwitz survivor laughing
Yes.
at that, it's suddenly funny.
Right. And then also it's well, who the hell am I to say it's not funny if an Auschwitz
Well, that's
survivor is laughing? And that's why it's so subjective. And it's just like you do point out in the film about turf. You know, if I'm a Jew and I think something's funny about the Holocaust, that's my business. Just like I don't get to use the N-word, but black people do because it's different. That's their turf, you know.
exactly who's telling the joke is a huge part of it, right? So, you know,
And to your point, what audience? That's a huge part
and
too.
what audience?
Right.
Like the same Holocaust joke in somebody in a neo-Nazi's mouth is suddenly not funny,
No.
you know, and you making a joke with the N-word, not funny.
Right.
I think that that's okay. And then back to the subjectivity of it. Like, so in my film, there's the two survivors, Renee and this woman, Ellie Gross, who, and they're in the gondola
Right.
and they're talking about, is it okay to laugh? And
Hmm.
is it okay to jokes? And Ellie is just, nothing is okay. It's never okay to laugh. Um, but she had a completely different experience than Renee. Renee came from a middle class family in Prague. It wasn't until the last year of the war where they came into the Hungarian Empire or whatever and took everyone to Auschwitz, knowing that the war was, I guess, turning. And she was completely assimilated. She had a completely different life than Ellie, who was born in Romania. Every child in her town was murdered except for her and one other. She was spit on from the minute she was born. She doesn't have one positive memory to look back on. Renee can almost choose at times to close up those bad years and have memories to look back on and nostalgia and whatever.
Hmm.
So who am I to say to Ellie, how could you not find that funny? Like
Right.
she has a completely different
But that's
experience.
but that's just the point. It's like find something funny if you wish. Don't find something funny if you wish. Today we
Exactly.
are living under this morality police state where a very small amount of people are starting to have great impact on what we can think is funny, what we can do, what we can read, what music, and the idea of cancel culture is not something new. I mean, everybody from Elvis, the Beatles, you point this out in your film Cancel Culture, and it's just interesting why all of a sudden it's just cancel culture, cancel culture, cancel. And is it just because social media? But this has been around for such a long time. There are always going to be people who sit back and go, I don't like that guy shaking his hips, therefore you can't watch it.
Right.
Are we just
But
always
that
going to
guy
deal
might have
with that?
said it and lived in the middle of nowhere and nobody heard him complain.
Right. Now he's got 1 million followers on TikTok and he's making hate films, and it's just, it's like a phenomenon that we're experiencing right now, where people like, Al Franken, Colin Kaepernick, Will Smith, Bud Light, you cite a lot of these in your film. But interestingly, only some of them manage to come back. Like Colin Kaepernick, he's still unemployed for kneeling. Jeffrey
Right.
Toobin jerked off on a Zoom call. He's back on CNN. Who gets to return? Who are
Well,
the
I
comeback
mean,
kids?
according to some people, that we spoke to, it sometimes comes down to economics. I mean, look at the
And race.
can the yeah, like the recent Kansas City Chiefs football
Yes.
player.
Harrison Bucker.
No, he's not going anywhere. He's not
I just heard today his jerseys are outselling Patrick Mahomes' jerseys. And Patrick Mahomes, he's like part owner in a women's football. Like he's a big advocate for women's rights. And Butker's jerseys are outselling his.
Yeah, because it comes down to finances, right? There are some people who are uncancelable. Some people you get why, and some people you don't,
who is uncancelable? I've always thought someone like Dave Chappelle is
I
uncancelable.
think he's uncancelable.
But there's
Yeah.
maybe a small handful in that category. What makes someone uncancelable?
That it's a bit of a mystery. With some people, it comes down to how much money they make for a brand, or if they lose money for a brand, maybe you can cancel that. And then there's some people that think no one's ever really canceled. But I would say that Kathy Griffin was really canceled.
Hmm.
Wouldn't you?
I would say that it's probably one of the few instances where I would sort of agree with it because it depicted horrific violence, a beheading. Like, I get the anger over someone like Trump, but I think that did cross a line, you know?
Yeah,
Uh,
I agree with that.
but
I
again,
agree with that.
it's
But it was like, did she know it was going to go that far? Like, I'm sure she regrets it. And, you know, but again, other people have done equal things. And like you say, they don't necessarily get canceled for it.
is it because she's a lightning rod to begin with? There's a lot of people that don't like her. I mean, has a huge fan base. I think she's hysterical, but it's easy to see how the people who never liked her for whatever reason were able to use this. You know, it's the squeaky wheel. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and they got a lot of grease out of this.
Yeah. I mean, we always sort of compared her story and Roseanne's story because they're sort of the same story, but from opposite sides of the political spectrum, right? And it was interesting to compare them. But Roseanne seems to be back.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think unless you've done something really, really horrible, you almost always come back. It just may take longer. Like Will Smith.
Yeah.
When is Will Smith going to come back? He's going to come back. He's just like the biggest box office draw in the history of film. And you said economics. There's somebody pushing the buttons going, this dude, we're losing billions by not making movies with him. And so there's going to be that point, that inflection point where it's like something happens or it's just time. It's Will Smith's time. Does he deserve to get what happened? Yeah, of course. He was violent on stage. You can't condone violence ever. Did he handle it well? No. So I think he got what he deserved.
I mean, that's another thing, the apology thing. People love to give other people that second chance, but you got to earn it. Dorman, who owns the Comedy Cellar, who's in the film, canceled, he calls them the apologies, like the hostage videos. Because, your people put you up to it, whatever. People know when it's real.
Like a Trump apology.
So people know, and they're looking for you to really like get it, and I think that's what it seems like.
So another part of the film that I thought was really amazing and sort of the point of your film was when Mel Brooks, he did his Hitler jokes back in 1948 at the Catskills, and some woman came up to him afterwards and said, I didn't find it in very good taste. And his answer was, I really don't give a shit about good taste. That's it. Like, to me, the movie was over there. That was it. End of story. Mind your business. I don't give a shit about good taste because you know what? What is good taste? And who gets to decide? Right? So that's the essence of the whole question.
But then he does care, right? Then
he does care in a strange way. He's like, oh, Holocaust, off limits. And you're like, seriously? Springtime for Hitler? Are you kidding? But in his mind, he has drawn that line. Mel Brooks has somehow made peace with the producers and all that goes with it, the Inquisition, and can't make fun of the Holocaust. That to me was so fascinating, but still in sync with the point of it's subjective. What I find funny doesn't have to be what you find funny.
Right. Right. And when he says the Holocaust, what he means are like literally about the victims and the genocide,
Right.
I think. But, it's funny because when I started the interviews, I started with the basic questions and then, personalized them, of course. But every single interview started with, "Do you have a Holocaust joke?" And I noticed that they would say, "Oh, I don't have a Holocaust joke, but I do have a Nazi joke." And that happened like my first 5 interviews. And I was like, oh my God. Like to me, it's all the same. It's all part of the same. And then I'd have to like go through like explaining that to the next people, like, do you have a Holocaust joke or a Nazi joke? But when I told Gilbert that story, he said, "Oh, because the Nazis had nothing to do with the Holocaust." Like he thought that was like he called that out.
I could see how obviously people being put in ovens, that's not funny. Nazis, okay, they could kind of be funny. They could be mocked. Hogan's Heroes, which Gilbert Gottfried commented on in your film, brilliantly, he said, who walked into a producer's office and said, here's the idea, a group of soldiers in a Nazi prison camp. It's comedy. But that is the funniest thing. And that show was a huge hit because it stripped away all of the gory stuff. And it was just focused on these dummies in Nazi uniforms.
Yeah, right. Exactly. One of the funniest jokes also to me is the Louis C.K. joke where, the Annie
Oh my God! That I was
girl
just
is
telling that to
crying
my
out.
co-producer Jen before we started. That was one of the funniest things I've ever seen, and
Very,
that's
very.
but also you have to have a genius mind to come up with that bit. What was that audition like? A
Right.
movie, Schindler's List, about the Holocaust. But here's this one element where this girl is just screaming, what did she say? Goodbye, goodbye, Jews. And he's wondering, like, how did she get that part? It is just so funny. I don't know. Maybe I'm Jewish, you're Jewish. Jews are funny, right? Maybe people just don't get us. They don't get us. They don't get our humor, right? Maybe
They
that's
do.
it. Maybe that's it.
Fun. I know a lot of people who are not Jewish that love Mel Brooks. You know, you don't get more Jewish than that.
No. Are you talking about people in the industry or just people on the street?
People.
Oh,
Well, some of my people are in the industry,
yeah,
but
I'm talking about non-industry people. Somebody sitting in the
I,
middle of Texas or Kansas or whatever, and we're in Illinois. Like, do they really understand Jewish humor? The don't worry, I'll just sit in the dark. Or, Jack Benny when
well,
who
I
got
think that they
skewered.
can recognize it as, my husband's not Jewish. He grew up as an army brat living all over the South. The first Jewish people he met was when he went to college, and because he just didn't live anywhere where there were Jews.
Right.
And his favorite shows were Rhoda and, like all these
Hmm.
shows with Jews. Did he know? He knew it was funny. I don't know if he got the like that was a very Jewishy, self-deprecating joke, but just on the pure funniness of it, got it. And I'm talking about when he was a little boy. Look, Seinfeld, for whatever reason, they were all Jewish, even though they didn't say they were, And people, look how popular that show was.
Hmm. Well, I think people can appreciate Jewish humor in a basic sense. I guess my question is more like understanding Jewish humor when Jews can make jokes about something that is seemingly off limits. Being able to laugh at something horrible, which maybe a lot of people can't do because they just don't think they're allowed to, or it's just not where their mind goes. So I think that part of Jewish humor, where you can really laugh at yourself and laugh at horror and use levity. I mean, I had a wife who was murdered. If I didn't have humor, I don't think I would have gotten through that. I don't know if other ethnic groups can do it as easily as Jews.
I mean, I would argue that you would find in communities of any oppressed groups that there is a lot of humor. I do think that for whatever reason, maybe because we're white, that people know Jewish humor. It's out there.
Hmm.
But the Black community, there's so much humor,
Hmm.
all these different communities, there's a lot of humor. It's just not necessarily, in the mainstream.
Right. Should there be things that are off limits, in your opinion?
Well, I'm a big believer in free speech. So, it is definitely complicated. Um,
Like, can you never joke about 9/11? Some
yeah,
comedians
well,
do, but should that be off limits? Some people think it should be. I
well,
don't. I mean,
well, clearly I don't because I was able to start funding this film based on a 9/11 joke in a way.
right.
You know what I mean? But it depends what the joke is being used for and how it's being used. I mean, if it's to, rile people up at a rally, and then, go off with weapons to, that gets very scary, but I don't see it that happening. And in the last laugh, Sarah talks about this. Now, again, we started to talk about the timeline of when I made the last laugh, which is really interesting if you want to talk about that. But she was talking about there was a Miss Hitler contest in Russia, and she thought, she says, I'm glad to know. I mean, I don't love that this is out there, but at least knowing about it makes me know that it exists, like, and I can.
And that's what she said. She also said that about Joan Rivers' joke. And she also said, not only is Joan keeping the Holocaust out there in her own way, but she's like, come on, there's genocide taking place all over the world. No one seems to give a shit about that, but they care about Joan Rivers' joke. And that
Right.
is that's a whole other conversation of why do people get so upset about a comedian's joke when, like, Uyghurs are getting killed in China. Like,
Right.
so
Well,
it's
like if you listen to Cliff Nesterhoff, he'll tell you that this was always comedians since the beginning of time have been complaining that they've been boycotted, or we're not allowed to joke about anything. It's just, again, like this cancel culture thing. It with social media, it feels so much bigger. Like that voice trying to shut people up or close people down is bigger and louder. So I think it always existed. I think comedians from the beginning of time will tell you, like, they're trying to shut me down. They're trying to tell me I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't say this. But it might have been one or two people, or like, a few people that boycotted a show. It didn't, or it like showed up in a little article in a local paper. I just don't think it had the power to spread like it does now.
Another thing that I thought was profound along these lines from your film was when Chelsea Handler said, just don't say anything stupid. Don't say anything racist, sexist, disrespectful. Just do that and you'll be fine. Like, is that really what it's all about? But then who are we talking about? A comedian? Because
so
the lines get blurred when we're talking about artists.
A film that I'm trying to make is with a friend of mine who's a Black director, and we are trying to take where we went with The Last Laugh when it opens up to other jokes and talk about jokes about race and stuff. You can make jokes about race that make you think about race and make you think about your own prejudices and racism or privilege or all of that. And then there are racist jokes.
Right.
There's a difference, And so
I think the problem, though, is that there are people who get mad at all of it. They don't make the distinction.
Well, exactly. And there are people that just want to shut things down.
Right.
That they are just like standing around. Exactly. I mean, that's why I say, like, if it's mean spirit, if it's racist, if it's bigoted, well, then maybe, Mark Maron says it. I think he says it brilliantly. He's like, you can say whatever you want. Nobody's telling you not to say it. You just have to deal with the consequences if you do say it.
Well, that was going to be one of my last questions to you, which is it really consequence culture? It's not cancel culture. I believe in free speech. You can do whatever you want, say whatever you want, be whoever you want, as long as it's not illegal. Just know that I get the same rights. I could go into your restaurant or not. I could read your books. I could watch your films or not, and when you're a performer and people don't pay for your art, your content, you could be in trouble. So it's really consequence culture that we're talking about.
I think that's partially true.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we're at a point where it's just about to explode? It's too much, and I'm going to start to just see a reversal? Or you think we're just continuing to head down this rabbit hole where more and more content and people are going to be prohibited from doing what they want and ultimately canceled?
I think that might depend on what happens in November.
Right. Well, that's a whole other episode.
But
eggs will be cheaper. Eggs will be cheaper. And you got to ask yourself, what's more important, freedom or a good brown cheap egg, right?
I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to figure out how with social media, the problem is that we are starting from such opposing positions, right? And everything is pick a side. There's no nuance. You can't discuss it. It's the monologue, not a dialogue. There's nothing in between.
Right.
And so you have that person who's complaining on Twitter or X or Instagram, whatever. You're going to find like-minded people. You're going to find it. And then it's going to spread to those people. And people want to hate on other people. And that's the part I think has to change. It's more about the psychology of what's going on with the divisiveness that has to be fixed. Because social media is not going anywhere.
Ferne, this has been really fun and interesting. Love chatting with you. Good luck with your films. They're fantastic. Yep. You're a terrific filmmaker, and I hope we'll get a chance to chat again sometime.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.